I was standing in the hallway outside a conference room I hadn't been invited to, looking through a strip of glass in the door, watching my best friend of 10 years describe a project as if she'd designed it herself. I'd come down that hallway on my way to grab a coffee refill. Nothing more purposeful than that. Still thinking about the structural revision deadline I'd been buried in all week, when I noticed the conference room lights on, the blinds only partially drawn, and recognized, with a small jolt, the renderings visible on the screen inside. My own renderings. The ones I hadn't shown to anyone outside the internal project team yet. I built this because I wanted people to actually want to be in the space, Priya was saying, gesturing at the renderings on the screen. Renderings I had produced, on my own laptop, over 4 separate weekends the previous spring. I counted the word "I" 7 times in about 4 minutes. I stood there in the hallway with a coffee going cold in my hand and counted it, the way you count something when you can't quite process what you're hearing any other way. An hour later, our division head sent out a firm-wide email announcing the new director of design, effective immediately. It was Priya. I read that email standing at my own desk, the cursor blinking in an unrelated document I'd been working on moments earlier. And I remember the strange, almost clinical detachment that settled over me in that first minute. The way I imagined shock must feel in the moments right before it actually registers as pain. I read the email twice, then a third time, checking the date, checking the sender, some part of my brain still hoping it might resolve into a different, more sensible shape if I just looked at it carefully enough. I want you to understand something before this story goes any further, because it would be easy for me to make this sound like a simple story about a coworker who stole credit for a project. It wasn't simple. Priya wasn't a coworker. She was, until that Tuesday afternoon, one of the 2 or 3 people I trusted most in the entire world. A friendship that had survived architecture school, 2 different cities, and enough late nights working through structural problems together that I genuinely believed nothing at work could ever come between us. This is the story of what happened when something finally did, and what I found once I finally started looking. My name is Natalie Reyes. I'm 33 years old, a senior project manager at a mid-size architecture firm that specializes in mixed-use commercial spaces. I met Priya Sharma in our 2nd year of architecture school, paired together on a studio project neither of us particularly wanted, and somehow became inseparable by the end of that semester. I still remember the first real conversation we had, past 2 in the morning in the studio, both of us exhausted, arguing cheerfully about whether a cantilevered roof structure we'd been assigned to model was even structurally honest, or just showing off. She laughed at something I said, this loud, unself-conscious laugh that got us both shushed by a classmate trying to nap on a nearby couch, and something about that moment just settled into place between us. The specific, immediate recognition of finding someone who thought about the world in a way that matched your own. We ended up redesigning that entire project together at 4 in the morning, neither of us willing to hand in something we didn't actually believe in, and turned in what became, unofficially, one of the better projects in our cohort that year. We graduated the same year, took different first jobs in different cities, kept up a friendship anyway through an embarrassing number of phone calls and a group chat that never really went quiet. 4 years ago, almost by accident, we both ended up applying to the same firm within a few months of each other. I remember how genuinely thrilled I was the day she got the offer. I thought, naively I suppose now, that having her there would make the job feel less like work and more like something closer to home. I should tell you about the kind of person I am at my job, because it matters enormously for understanding everything that happened afterward. Early in my career, at my first firm out of school, I watched a senior architect lose an entire project's worth of credit because a junior partner quietly took over the client relationship during the final weeks and let the client assume the work had always been his. Her name was Diane, and she'd been the one who trained me during my first 18 months in the industry. Patient in a way that good mentors are patient, walking me through the parts of the job nobody teaches you in school, how to actually manage a client relationship over years, not just months. She used to tell me, in those early months, that the actual craft of the work would always matter more than how loudly you talked about it, that quality had its own quiet gravity if you were patient enough to let it work. I believed her completely at the time. Watching what eventually happened to her own career complicated that belief in ways I spent years working through. Though I never fully abandoned it, I simply learned to pair it with something more practical. The plain, unglamorous discipline of keeping a record alongside the quality itself, so the two could stand together, instead of quality alone being left to fend for itself against someone else's louder story. I watched the whole thing unfold slowly, almost politely, over about 6 weeks, the junior partner scheduling more and more of the client calls himself, citing Diane's busy schedule, gradually becoming the face of a relationship she'd spent 3 years building. By the time the promotion decision came around, the client's feedback to leadership credited him almost entirely. I've often wondered since whether Diane ever fully understood in real time what was happening to her, or whether it only became clear in hindsight, the way betrayal so often does, obvious only once you're standing far enough away from it to see the whole shape at once. I promised myself, watching her pack up her office that final week, that I would never let myself be caught in that same particular blind spot, not realizing what was happening until it was already too late to do anything but grieve it. Diane left the firm about 8 months later. I never forgot the quiet, particular unfairness of watching someone lose something that was unmistakably hers, simply because she hadn't documented the parts of her work that lived in conversation rather than paper. I watched that senior architect, a woman I deeply admired, get passed over for a promotion that went instead to the man who'd swooped in at the end. I decided then, watching that happen, that I would never let my own work exist only in memory, only in verbal understanding, only in the good faith that people would remember things accurately later. It's a strange kind of discipline to build, honestly, documenting your own work as though you're preparing a defense for something that hasn't happened yet. Colleagues used to tease me gently about it over the years, joked that I ran my project files like an auditor rather than a designer. I always laughed along with them, never quite explaining the specific memory of Diane's last few months at that first firm. The quiet, humiliating unraveling of a career built on trust that turned out not to be enough on its own. I started keeping meticulous version histories on every project I touched, every draft dated and saved, every major decision documented in the project management software with my name attached to the timestamp. It wasn't paranoia, exactly. It was just a habit I built after watching what happens to people who don't have one. The Marlowe Commons project came to me 18 months before any of this happened. A mixed-use retail and residential redevelopment downtown. The kind of project that could genuinely make a career if it went well. I remember the exact morning we won the pitch to even begin work on it, standing in Carol's office with 2 other project managers who'd also submitted proposals, waiting to hear which concept the client had selected. The 3 of us had stood there in an awkward little cluster, each of us pretending not to be nervous, each of us having poured weeks into our respective proposals. I remember focusing hard on a water stain on the ceiling tile above Carol's desk, some strange coping mechanism for the waiting, while she flipped through the folder on her desk with what felt, in the moment, like agonizing slowness. When Carol told me it was mine, I actually had to sit down in the chair behind me, the specific kind of disbelief that comes with getting something you'd wanted badly enough that you'd stopped quite letting yourself expect it. I called Priya from the parking garage before I even got in my car, practically shouting the news into the phone, and she screamed with genuine excitement on the other end, told me she was taking me to dinner that night to celebrate. No arguments allowed. I was the lead from the very first client meeting. I sketched the first concept on a legal pad during that meeting, sitting across from the client's development team, sketching while they talked because that's simply how my brain works best, translating what people say into shapes while they're still speaking. Priya joined the project about 4 months in, brought on in a supporting capacity to help manage some of the interior design elements, a smaller piece of a much larger whole. I welcomed her onto it happily. I remember thinking it would be nice to have my closest friend working alongside me on the biggest project of my career so far. Priya was skilled at client relationships and presentation in a way I'd always genuinely admired, even envied a little. The specific ease she had walking into a room full of strangers and making them feel like she'd known them for years. It was part of what made her so good at her job, and part of what made the eventual betrayal sting in such a specific way. Because I'd spent a decade watching that same charm turned toward good ends, toward closing deals that benefited the whole team, toward smoothing over tense client meetings I wasn't always naturally suited to handle myself. I never once, in all those years, imagined that same skill for narrative control would eventually be turned toward rewriting whose story a project actually was. There's a particular kind of grief in realizing a person's greatest strength was, all along, also their most dangerous one, and that you simply never had reason to see it that way until it was pointed directly at you. For the first year of that project, things were exactly what I'd hoped they'd be. We worked well together, genuinely well. Late nights ordering takeout in the office, arguing over material selections, celebrating small wins together the way you do when you actually like the person you're building something with. I remember one particular night, maybe 8 months into the project, when we were both stuck on how to handle a difficult zoning restriction on the northern edge of the site, sketching alternate configurations on napkins from the Thai place down the street until nearly midnight, both of us laughing more than the actual problem probably warranted, just glad to be solving something difficult alongside someone we trusted completely. I remember thinking, driving home that night, that I couldn't imagine building anything significant without her somewhere nearby. I don't think, looking back now, that anything about that first year was fake. I think it was real, and something shifted later, gradually, in ways I was too close to the friendship to notice while it was happening. The director role opened up about 4 months before the pitch that changed everything. Our division head, a woman named Carol who I'd worked under for 3 years, called me into her office on an ordinary Thursday afternoon and told me, plainly, that I was the clear frontrunner for the position, largely on the strength of the Marlow Commons work. She told me to keep doing exactly what I was doing, that the promotion was essentially mine to lose. I remember walking out of that meeting feeling a kind of quiet, settled happiness I hadn't felt in a long time. The specific satisfaction of watching years of careful, unglamorous work finally about to be recognized. I told Priya that same evening, over drinks at the bar near our office we'd been going to since our first month working together. "Nat, this is huge," she said, gripping my hand across the table. "This is everything you've worked for. I'm so proud of you I could cry right now." I asked her if she thought it was strange, us both being up for similar territory eventually, since her own career was moving quickly too. She waved the question away almost before I finished asking it. "There's room for both of us to win," she said. "That's not how this has to work. I want this for you as much as I'd want it for myself." I remember her face when I told her, a flicker of something I read, at the time, as pure happiness for me. She hugged me across the table, nearly knocking over both our glasses, and told me it was about time somebody noticed everything I did around there. I believed her completely. I had no reason not to. Looking back now, I can trace the shift with a precision I didn't have while it was actually happening. It started small, the way these things almost always do. Priya began offering to help present pieces of the project to the client, framing it as taking some of the workload off me during an especially busy stretch. I remember the first time it happened clearly. A Tuesday afternoon client check-in call about material finishes, a fairly minor agenda item. "I'll hop on that one so you can keep pushing on the structural drawings," she told me. And I remember feeling genuinely grateful in the moment, thinking how lucky I was to have a friend at work who paid attention to when I was overloaded. That seemed generous at the time, even kind. Then she started asking to sit in on strategy calls I hadn't originally looped her into. Calls about the structural revisions, about budget negotiations, aspects of the project fairly far outside her original interior design scope. "I just want to understand the full picture better," she told me once, when I asked, mildly, why she wanted to be on a budget call that had nothing to do with her actual deliverables. "It'll help me support you better. I want to know this project as well as you do." I let her in, because why wouldn't I let my closest friend sit in on calls? Because refusing felt petty and territorial in a way that didn't match who I believed we were to each other. Looking back, I wonder now whether some quieter, more cautious part of me noticed the pattern earlier than I let myself admit. Some small hesitation I talked myself out of each time, because acknowledging it would have meant questioning a friendship I'd built my entire adult life around. I remember mentioning it once, lightly, to James over dinner, that Priya seemed to be getting more involved in parts of the project outside her usual scope. He'd asked, reasonably, whether that bothered me. I told him it didn't, that I trusted her completely, and at the time, saying it out loud, I believed every word of it. About 6 weeks before the promotion was announced, Carol mentioned, almost in passing, that the client wanted a formal pitch presentation to finalize the next construction phase, a bigger meeting than our usual working sessions, senior stakeholders from the client side, a chance to really showcase the project's direction going forward. I started preparing for it immediately, building out the presentation deck myself, the way I built every major presentation on that project from the beginning. 3 days before that pitch, Priya came to my desk and told me, casually, that the meeting had gotten moved up on the calendar, and that given how slammed I already was with the structural revision deadline that same week, she'd go ahead and handle presenting this one herself, that it was really more of a formality at this stage anyway, nothing I needed to stress about fitting into an already impossible week. "You've basically already done all the hard part," she said, leaning against my cubicle wall. "I'll just walk them through where things stand. Focus on getting those revisions done. That's the part that actually matters this week." "Are you sure?" I asked her. "This is a pretty big meeting to hand off." "I've got it, Nat," she said, smiling. "Trust me. Go finish the drawings." I remember feeling relieved, actually, in the moment. I remember thanking her for taking something off my plate. I had no idea, standing at my own desk, thanking my best friend for her thoughtfulness, that I was thanking her for quietly removing me from the single most important meeting of the entire project. I found out what actually happened in that room almost by accident. A coworker named Marcus, who'd been in the pitch meeting representing our engineering team, sent a congratulations text that afternoon, meant for Priya, celebrating what he assumed was already common office knowledge. He fat-fingered the contact and sent it to me instead. I was at my desk finishing exactly the structural revisions Priya had told me to focus on, headphones in, deep enough in a load calculation that I almost didn't notice my phone buzz on the desk beside me. When I glanced at it, still half thinking about beam spans, it took a second for the words to actually register. "Congrats on director," the message read. Marlowe Commons' pitch clearly sealed the deal. That was seriously impressive work in there today. I sat at my desk, staring at that message for a long moment, trying to make it mean something other than what it obviously meant. I hadn't heard anything about a director announcement. I hadn't been in any pitch meeting that day. I texted Marcus back, carefully, asking what he meant, and he responded within a minute, confused himself now, saying he'd assumed I already knew, that the firm-wide email had gone out about 20 minutes earlier. "Wait, you didn't get the email?" he wrote. I figured you of all people would have been the first to know. You were the one who basically built that whole project, weren't you?" I didn't answer him right away. I remember staring at that last question, sitting there in plain text on my phone screen, from someone who had actually been in the room and apparently still understood, correctly, exactly whose work he'd been looking at, even while congratulating someone else for building it. I opened my email with hands that weren't entirely steady and found the announcement Carol had sent to the whole office. New Director of Design, Priya Sharma. The email praised her leadership on Marlow Commons specifically, called out her vision for the project's next phase, thanked her for representing the firm so impressively in that afternoon's client pitch. I sat very still at my desk for what felt like a long time, the office noise around me continuing exactly as normal. Phones ringing, someone laughing near the printer. None of it registering the way a room usually registers when the ground has just disappeared underneath one particular person sitting in it. I called my husband James from the stairwell because I couldn't trust my voice to hold steady walking back past Priya's desk to get to the elevator. He picked up on the second ring, and I remember how long it took me to actually get words out, standing there on a concrete landing between the third and fourth floors. "Nat, what's wrong?" he said, his voice immediately sharp with concern. "Are you okay? What happened?" I told him, haltingly, standing in that stairwell, everything I'd just pieced together. The text message, the email, the pitch I hadn't been invited to. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone very controlled. The specific calm he gets when he's genuinely angry on my behalf, and trying not to make things harder for me by showing it. "That's not okay, Nat," he said. "That's not a misunderstanding. You need to see exactly what happened before you decide what to do about it. Don't make any decisions tonight. Just come home." I did the only thing that felt available to me in that moment, which was walk down the hallway toward the large conference room where, I now understood, the pitch had actually taken place. Not moved up at all, simply moved to exclude me entirely. Through the strip of glass in the door, I watched the tail end of what must have been a wrap-up conversation. Priya standing at the front of the room beside the presentation screen, still mid-sentence, the client's development team nodding along, visibly impressed. "I built this because I wanted people to actually want to be in the space," she was saying, and I stood there in the hallway with a coffee going cold in my hand and counted it. The way you count something when you can't quite process what you're hearing any other way. I didn't go in. I want to be honest about that. Every instinct in me said to push open that door and correct the record right there, in front of the client, in front of everyone. I didn't do it. Some part of me, even in that moment of pure shock, understood that walking into a room and making a scene would accomplish nothing, except making me look unstable in front of the exact people whose opinion mattered most for the project's future. I stood there in that hallway for what felt like a long time, but was probably closer to 30 seconds, watching through the glass as the client's development team nodded along, one of them actually applauding softly at something Priya said, a gesture I'd never once received in 18 months of building the actual thing they were applauding. I remember pressing my back against the wall beside the door, out of the sightline, breathing carefully, running through in my head all the reasons walking in would be a mistake, even as some other, louder part of me wanted very badly to do exactly that. I turned around and walked back to my desk instead, sat down, and simply breathed for a while, trying to figure out what to actually do with what I'd just seen and heard. That evening, alone in my apartment, I opened the firm's project management software, the same system I'd used to document every single stage of Marlow Commons from its very first sketch. I made tea I didn't end up drinking, sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop, and clicked into the project's history tab, something I hadn't actually looked at in months, since checking version history wasn't something you do in the middle of a project running smoothly, only something you'd think to do once something had gone wrong enough to need proof. The version history was all still there, exactly as I'd left it, month after month of drafts, every major structural decision time-stamped and attributed to my account. The original concept sketch I'd scanned in after that very first client meeting, dated a full 4 months before Priya had ever joined the project at all. I scrolled through it slowly, watching my own career pass by in file names and timestamps. Draft_concept_V1 dated 14 months earlier. Structural_revision_final dated just 3 weeks ago. Dozens of entries in between. Each one a small, ordinary Tuesday I probably hadn't thought twice about at the time. Now suddenly evidence of something I never imagined I'd need to prove. I don't think Priya knew that version history was as complete as it was. Or maybe she assumed, correctly for most people, that nobody would ever bother checking it. She'd never been the one managing the software day to day. That had always been my job on the project. A task so mundane neither of us had ever discussed it as something worth remembering. James sat beside me at the kitchen table while I scrolled through it, not saying much, just present, occasionally pointing at a particular timestamp and asking me to explain what it showed. "Look at this one," he said at one point, tapping the screen where the original concept sketch sat, dated and attributed, 4 months before Priya's name appeared anywhere in the project at all. This alone proves the whole thing. This isn't ambiguous, Nat. This is a fact with a date on it. I told him I didn't know yet what I wanted to do with any of it. He told me I didn't have to know that night, that having the proof didn't obligate me to use it any particular way, that I could take my time deciding what mattered more to me, the friendship or the truth, without anyone rushing me toward either one. I confronted her the next morning, in a small conference room I booked specifically because I needed a closed door and a private conversation, not another audience. She walked in already looking guarded, like she'd anticipated this conversation was coming, sat down across from me with her arms crossed before I'd said a single word. I laid out what I'd seen, what Marcus's text had said, what the email had announced, and asked her directly to explain it to me. I was helping present the project's story more effectively for the client, she said, her voice careful, measured in a way I'd never heard her use with me before. "You know how client pitches work, Nat. It's about confidence, about ownership, about telling a clear narrative. I wasn't trying to erase you. You said, 'I built this,'" I told her. "Not we, not my team, I. That's just pitch language," she said. "Everyone internally already understands your contribution. I don't know why you're making this into something it isn't." I asked her why, if my contribution was so obviously understood internally, she hadn't simply told the client that the project's original architect and lead couldn't make the meeting, and left it there, instead of allowing an entire client development team, and apparently the firm's own division head, to believe the vision they were praising was hers alone. "You're twisting this," Priya said, her voice rising slightly. "I've supported you this entire project. I've been there every late night, every deadline. Don't act like I contributed nothing." "I never said you contributed nothing," I told her. "I said you took credit for the parts that weren't yours." Priya didn't have a good answer to that question. She grew defensive instead, told me I was being paranoid, that 10 years of friendship should count for something, that she couldn't believe I was treating an opportunity she'd earned as some kind of theft. I remember sitting across that small table from her, watching her reframe, in real time, something that felt to me like the plainest kind of betrayal into something that sounded, in her retelling, almost like generosity toward me that I was too bitter to appreciate. I left that room feeling, strangely, more disoriented than angry, at least in that first hour. The specific vertigo of hearing someone you've trusted for 10 years describe your own memory back to you as somehow mistaken. I sat in my car in the parking garage afterward for a long time before I trusted myself to drive, replaying her words, checking them against what I actually remembered, and finding, each time, that my version held up, that I hadn't imagined any of it, no matter how confidently she'd suggested otherwise. I left that conversation more shaken than I'd been the day before, because the day before I'd only lost a promotion. That morning, I understood I might also be losing the friendship underneath it, and worse, that the friendship might have been quietly hollowing out for longer than I wanted to admit to myself. I spent that whole weekend turning the decision over and over, whether to escalate formally, whether to simply let it go and try to rebuild some smaller version of the friendship, whether either option would leave me feeling like I'd actually respected myself afterward. James, wisely, didn't push me toward either choice, just kept asking good questions over the 2 days. What would formally escalating actually accomplish? What would letting it go actually cost me long-term? Until I'd talked my own way through most of the considerations myself, without him ever telling me what to do. I went into that Monday still uncertain, which is, I've come to understand since, sometimes exactly the honest place to start from, rather than forcing false clarity too early. The weeks after that were some of the hardest of my professional life. Harder in some ways than the initial shock itself. I kept showing up to work every day, kept doing my job competently, kept sitting in meetings where Priya now outranked me. Technically my superior on paper for a project I had built from a legal pad sketch. There was a particular Tuesday, about 2 weeks in, when Priya ran a project status meeting for Marlowe Commons, standing at the whiteboard directing tasks to people, including me, on a project I had led from its very first sketch. I remember sitting at that table taking notes on an action item she'd assigned me, on my own project, and feeling something hollow out in my chest that I hadn't fully braced myself for, even after everything else. I wrote the action item down anyway, in my usual, careful handwriting, because that was still my job, still the work I'd committed to seeing through. Regardless of who technically stood at the front of the room now, I remember catching Marcus's eye across the table at one point, a brief, uncomfortable flicker of recognition passing between us, both of us apparently thinking the same unspoken thing, and neither of us saying it out loud in that room. I withdrew, not dramatically, not in any way anyone would necessarily notice from the outside. Just a quiet pulling back from the easy warmth that used to characterize how I moved through that office. I stopped eating lunch in the break room, where I used to sit with Priya most days. Started bringing my own lunch to eat quietly at my desk instead. I stopped staying late for the casual, unstructured conversations we used to have after most other people had gone home. It wasn't a decision I made consciously, so much as something that simply happened, the natural result of not knowing anymore how to be around someone I'd trusted completely. Robert Chen noticed anyway. Robert was a senior partner at the firm, one of the people who'd mentored me most closely in my early years there, a man with an old-school reputation for caring more about the actual quality and integrity of the work than about office politics. He stopped by my desk one afternoon about 3 weeks after the promotion announcement, sat down in the chair across from me without being invited to, the way he sometimes did when he wanted an honest conversation rather than a professional one. He was quiet for a moment, watching me work before saying anything at all, the way I remembered him doing back when I was a junior architect he was training, letting a silence sit until it became easier to fill honestly than to keep avoiding. "You've been quiet lately," Robert said. "Quieter than I've ever seen you, actually. Something happen with the Marlowe project?" I hesitated for a long moment before answering him, weighing what it would mean to say anything at all, whether it would sound like sour grapes, whether it would damage the friendship further, whatever was left of it to damage. "It's fine," I started to say. The automatic response, the one I'd been giving everyone for 3 weeks. "Natalie," he said, gently but firmly, using my full name the way he only did when he wanted me to actually hear him. "I've known you 8 years. I know what fine sounds like from you, and this isn't it." But something about the plain, patient way he asked made it feel possible to just tell him the truth, without dramatizing it, without asking him to do anything in particular about it. I told him about the sketch from the first client meeting. I told him about the 18 months of work, the version history, the pitch I'd been quietly excluded from, the email announcing a promotion for work I understood, by every honest measure, to have been substantially mine. I didn't ask him to fix it. I genuinely didn't know, saying it out loud, what I even wanted him to do with what I was telling him. Robert listened without interrupting, the way he always had. And when I finished, he simply asked if I still had access to that version history. I told him I did. He asked me to send it to him, not as a formal complaint, just so he could understand the full shape of what had happened. "I want to be clear," he added before I could respond. "This doesn't have to go anywhere you don't want it to go. I'm not asking so I can go start a fight on your behalf. I'm asking because I think it matters that someone with the authority to actually look carefully has looked carefully." I appreciated that more than I could easily say in the moment. The specific relief of being asked without being pushed, of someone offering to simply see clearly rather than promising to fix anything. I sent it to him that evening, a straightforward export of the project's full history, timestamps, drafts, my name attached to work going back over a year before Priya had ever touched the project. I didn't attach any commentary. I let the record speak for itself, the same record that had sat quietly on that server the entire time, waiting, I suppose, for someone to actually look at it. Robert didn't say much in the days immediately after that. He didn't announce anything. He didn't call a meeting. Whatever conversations happened at his level happened privately, the way institutional course corrections often do in a firm like ours, quietly, without theater. I found out much later, from Carol in an unguarded moment, that Robert had apparently spent a full afternoon going through the version history I'd sent him, cross-referencing dates against his own memory of the project's early milestones, before ever mentioning any of it to another partner. He wasn't the kind of person who acted on incomplete information, and I understood, hearing that detail, exactly why his eventual response had carried the quiet weight it did. He hadn't taken my word for it. He'd checked, carefully, the same way I'd been careful all along, and the record had held up exactly as I'd known it would. About 2 weeks later, Carol called me into her office again, the same office where she'd once told me I was the clear frontrunner for a promotion I never received. She looked slightly uncomfortable when I sat down, which struck me as unusual for Carol, who I'd always known as almost unflappably direct. This time, she told me the firm had landed a major new client, a downtown cultural center redevelopment, and that she wanted me leading it directly, reporting to Robert, rather than through the new director structure. "This one's high visibility," Carol said. "Robert specifically asked that you lead it. He was pretty clear about that." I asked her, carefully, whether this had anything to do with Marlowe Commons. She paused for a moment before answering, choosing her words with more care than I was used to from her. "I think Robert saw some things that concerned him," she said. "I'm not going to pretend I know everything that happened on that project, but I trust his judgment, and he trusts yours. That's really all I can tell you right now." "I appreciate you being straight with me about that," I told her, "even the limited version of it." Carol nodded, something almost apologetic crossing her face, like she understood there was more to the story than she was being given, and chose not to press further out of respect for however Robert wanted it handled. She didn't explain the reasoning in detail. She didn't need to. I understood, sitting across from her, that whatever Robert had seen in that version history had mattered enough to matter. even if it never became a public reckoning, even if Priya's title never officially changed. Priya sensed the shift almost immediately. She found me by the elevators one evening not long after, asked, with a kind of careful lightness that didn't quite land, whether we could grab drinks sometime soon, get back to normal. "I miss you," she said, and for a moment, standing there, I almost believed she meant it, uncomplicated by anything else. "We used to tell each other everything, Nat. I hate this distance between us," I told her, as gently as I could manage, that I didn't think there was a normal left to get back to, not the kind she meant. "Is this still about the pitch?" she asked, something defensive creeping back into her voice, despite the softer opening. "I already told you I wasn't trying to hurt you." "I know you told me that," I said. "I just don't think I believe it changes what actually happened." She didn't argue with that. She just nodded, something unreadable crossing her face, and got into the elevator alone. Word travels in this industry in ways that have very little to do with formal announcements. I found out how far it had actually spread at an industry mixer about a month after everything happened. An event I'd almost skipped entirely, not particularly in the mood for small talk with people from other firms. I'd nearly canceled twice that week, telling James I didn't have the energy to make polite conversation while pretending everything at work was normal. He'd gently encouraged me to go anyway, pointed out that isolating myself further wasn't going to make any of it easier to carry. I'm glad, looking back, that I listened to him, though I didn't fully appreciate why until I was standing there with a drink in my hand an hour into the event, expecting nothing more than forgettable small talk. A woman I barely knew, an architect from a firm across town, approached me near the bar and mentioned, almost offhandedly, that she'd heard I was the one behind the Marlow Commons concept, said the site plan had come up in a conversation with someone from the client's development team, who'd apparently been quite specific about whose original sketch had shaped the whole direction. I remember standing there, glass in hand, genuinely startled by how plainly she said it, like it was simply a known fact rather than something I'd spent weeks quietly carrying alone. Over the following weeks, in the specific, quiet way these things spread through a professional community that's smaller than it looks, people who'd been in that original pitch meeting, people from the client's development team, started mentioning in passing at industry events exactly whose sketch the project had originally come from. I never orchestrated any of that. I never needed to. The truth simply had somewhere real to attach itself now, timestamps and drafts sitting quietly behind it the entire time. A recruiter named Dana Ferris reached out to me about 6 weeks after the promotion announcement, representing a competing firm across town, one I genuinely respected. We met at a coffee shop a few blocks from my office, Dana already seated at a corner table when I arrived. Warm and direct in a way I appreciated immediately. She told me, over coffee, that a mutual client contact had mentioned my name specifically in connection with Marlow Commons, had described, admiringly, work Dana's firm would be lucky to have access to going forward. "Honestly," Dana said, leaning forward slightly, "I did a little digging after that conversation. Your name is all over the early planning documentation on that project, at least the parts our client contact was willing to share. I don't know the full story over there, and it's not really my business. But I know talent when I see the paper trail behind it, and I wanted to talk to you before anyone else did." I remember sitting across from her, turning my coffee cup slowly in my hands, feeling something settle inside me that I hadn't fully expected to feel again so soon after everything that had happened. Something close to being simply, plainly seen for what I'd actually built. "What would working with your team actually look like?" I asked her, and she smiled, like she'd been hoping I'd ask exactly that. She walked me through it over the next 20 minutes, an actual seat-leading design on a growing portfolio of civic projects, direct client relationships from day one, no ambiguity about whose name would sit on the work. I remember driving home afterward, windows down despite the slight chill in the air, feeling something I hadn't let myself feel in months, something close to simple excitement about the future, rather than just careful management of the present. I gave my notice 3 weeks later. Carol tried to counter, offered me a formal director title of my own this time, an offer that, 6 months earlier, would have meant everything to me. Sitting across from her that final time, I could tell she genuinely meant the offer, that some part of her wanted to fix, belatedly, what had gone wrong the first time around. "We could make this right, Natalie," she said. "A real title, a real seat at the table this time, no ambiguity about it. I hope you'll consider staying." "I appreciate that," I told her, and I meant it. "But I don't think this is about the title anymore, Carol. I don't want to keep building things in a place where I have to wonder whether the record will actually hold if something like this happens again." I turned it down, not out of spite, but because I understood, by then, that I didn't want to keep building things inside a structure where recognition depended on being the loudest person in a room I hadn't even been allowed into. My first morning at the new firm, I opened a blank project file under my own name. Nobody else's account attached, no history to protect, no friendship complicating what should have simply been professional trust from the start. The office itself felt different in small, specific ways that mattered more than I expected. A corner desk with actual natural light. A team lead named Sophia who introduced herself by asking what I needed to do my best work, rather than what I could take off her plate. Sophia sat down across from me that first morning with a cup of coffee for each of us, walked me through the team's current projects, and at one point, almost as an aside, mentioned that she'd read through some of my portfolio work before my interview. Specifically praised the clarity of a structural approach I'd used on an earlier project, one that had nothing to do with Marlowe Commons at all. It was such a small, ordinary thing, being complimented accurately on my own actual work, and yet I remember it landing with unexpected weight. The plain, uncomplicated experience of being seen correctly by someone with no other agenda attached to the seeing. I remember unpacking a small box of things from my old desk, a framed photo, a favorite mug, a scale ruler I'd had since architecture school, and setting them down in a space that felt, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, entirely uncomplicated. I sat there for a moment before I started sketching, remembering that first legal pad, that first client meeting, the version of myself who had assumed, back then, that good work simply spoke for itself, that credit was something that arrived automatically if you were talented and patient enough. James asked me that evening, over dinner, how the first day had gone. I told him it felt strange, in a good way, to build something without wondering who else might later stand up in a room and describe it as theirs. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Didn't say much else. Just let the quiet, uncomplicated relief of that sentence sit between us for a while. I know now that isn't quite true. Good work doesn't always speak for itself. Sometimes it needs a record. Sometimes it needs someone who kept one, quietly, for reasons that had nothing to do with anticipating betrayal, and everything to do with simply being the kind of person who writes things down. I don't know if Priya and I will ever speak again in any real way. I've made a kind of peace with that uncertainty. What I do know is that I stopped waiting for anyone else to correct the record on my behalf. I just made sure, from that point forward, that the record was always there, plainly, under my own name, whether or not anyone ever thought to go looking for it. That's the part nobody tells you about doing quiet, careful work for people you love. Loving someone completely doesn't mean assuming they'll never take something from you. It just means, when they do, you get to decide what kind of person you want to be about it afterward. I decided I wanted to be the kind of person who builds things honestly, documents them carefully, and walks away clean when the room I'm standing in no longer deserves what I'm capable of building inside it. I think about Priya sometimes, more than I probably let on to anyone, including James. Not with the raw anger I felt those first few weeks. That's mostly settled now into something quieter, sadder, less useful to hold on to tightly. I think about the version of her I knew at 19, laughing too loud in that architecture studio at 2 in the morning, and I wonder, honestly, at what point ambition started mattering to her more than the people standing beside her while she built it. I don't have a clean answer to that. I'm not sure she does either. Sometimes I try to locate the exact moment it started, some single conversation or decision I could point back to and say, there, that's where it changed. I've never found one. I think that's simply how these things usually work. Not one dramatic turn, but 100 small ones, each easy enough to justify on its own, until they've added up to something neither person quite intended, and neither person can fully take back. What I do know is this: the next time I build something significant, and I fully intend to build many more significant things, I won't be documenting every detail out of fear the way I might have started doing right after all of this happened. I'll be doing it the same way I always did, quietly, out of habit because it's simply who I am. The difference now is that I understand exactly why that habit matters. Not as paranoia, but as a plain form of self-respect. You build the thing, you keep the record, and if anyone ever tries to tell a different story about what you built, the truth is already sitting there, patiently, waiting to be found. Some evenings, sketching at my new desk, I still catch myself instinctively glancing up to see if anyone's watching before I let myself feel genuinely proud of something I've drafted. An old habit from a decade of sharing that feeling automatically with someone who isn't there to share it with anymore. I'm working on unlearning that particular reflex. Most days now, I manage it just fine, sitting with my own quiet satisfaction in a piece of work, understanding, finally, that it never actually needed anyone else's applause to be real.